Hi, we're going to talk through the argument FRQ that you have to do for the AP Comparative Politics exam that's coming up. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you, but I've sent an e-version of myself here. So for today's practice argument FRQ, we're going to talk through this question. Develop an argument for whether independent judiciaries strengthen or weaken democracy. Use one or more of the following course concepts in your response: life terms, accountability, rule of law. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis that establishes a line of reasoning using one or more of the provided course concepts. Support your claim with at least two pieces of specific and relevant evidence from one or more course countries. The evidence should be relevant to one or more of the course provided concepts. So first off, we need to make sure that you understand what the term independent judiciary means, because if you don't understand that term, you're not going to have a very successful time answering this question. An independent judiciary is free from external pressure or political intimidation. It means that the courts are able to make a decision, and it doesn't matter whether or not the president agrees with them or not. They still have the freedom to make that decision. They cannot be fired as a result of their decision. Okay, so an independent judiciary is making decisions that might not be politically popular, but are hopefully in the interests of justice. Okay, and so the question is whether or not it can strengthen or weaken democracy. So this leads me to believe that we should be focusing on the democratic countries that we studied out of the AP 6. So for this review, I'm going to focus on how independent judiciaries function in Mexico, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom, and not the other three countries because they are not, one might argue they are more authoritarian than democratic. Okay? Next, you need to make sure that you understand these terms. Life terms, like whether or not, so in the United States, if you're appointed to the Supreme Court, you get that position until you retire or you die, or you're found guilty of committing some sort of serious crime and you can get impeached. But in the United States, people get life terms. Okay. Accountability. So like they have to be accountable to the people. Normally we think of accountability as being like that you would be elected, or you would have, you would have to be responsible for your decisions in some sort of capacity. And then lastly, this idea of rule of law. Rule of law means that the laws apply to everyone. And it doesn't matter if you're a justice on the Supreme Court, if you're president, if you're a public school teacher, if you're a student, everybody is expected to follow the law. Okay? So you have to keep those three ideas in mind: life terms, accountability, rule of law, because you need to be thinking about some examples here. Before we have you brainstorm how to answer this prompt, I want you to think through these three democracies, Mexico, Nigeria, and the UK, and I want you to think about first, does it have an independent judiciary? Why or why not? To remember, how does that judicial system even work? Because those would be important things to have up your sleeve. And then examples of how their judiciary has or hasn't, helped their democracy. So why don't you press pause on this video, make a little chart like this in your notebook, and give yourself about 5 minutes to sort of sketch through thinking about these three countries in these three ways. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to think through these three countries, whether or not it has an independent judiciary, how it works, and examples of how it has or hasn't helped their democracy. Okay? So if we start off with Mexico, I would say sort of. Freedom House, if you remember, that's one of the places that you could see data pulled from the quantitative data analysis question. Freedom House gives countries scores sort of rating their level of democratic functioning. And when I looked at their independent judiciary numbers, they gave both Mexico and Nigeria's 2 out of 4. Okay, which is not a great rating. Like that's 50%. I think you and I both consider 50% enough. In terms of how Mexico's judicial system works, Justices are appointed by the president, who is elected by the people, but the justices themselves are not elected. The justices have a 15-year term limit. The justices do have the power to decide whether or not something is unconstitutional if it is requested by a third vote of the lower house. So they have judicial review, but only if they're asked to sort of intervene. Okay, so it's different how it functions in the United States. If we look at Nigeria, I said that Freedom House also gave them 2 out of 4. The Constitution does make this promise of judicial independence. It has a court system that's very similar to the United States, which also has the judicial review, the ability to decide whether or not the actions by another branch are not constitutional. And interestingly enough, in their form of federalism, individual states get to set up their own legal system, and 12 states have set up Sharia courts where they're using Islamic law. Okay? In the United Kingdom, Freedom House gave them a score of 4 out of 4, and people are appointed, justices are appointed by a committee now. This is different than what it used to be, but they're appointed by a committee now of legal experts, and they aren't aligned politically with a particular party, okay, because they're supposed to be making decisions in the interest of justice, as opposed to for the conservatives or for the Labor Party or for this party or that party, okay? They don't have the authority to review, okay, legislation by Parliament, and it doesn't have final judicial authority, okay? So they have an independent judiciary, but they don't have full judicial review, which is not what the question is asking, but I wanted to distinguish that, okay? Thinking about examples of how these 3 countries' court systems work, if we look first at Mexico, Freedom House specifically says that they do not have a strong sense of rule of law. Well, boom, that's one of the terms that you were asked to, one of the core concepts that you were asked to tie into, because people who commit serious crimes are not punished. So they have a high rate of murder in Mexico, and there is a low prosecution rate, let alone conviction rate for those murders, which means that people feel like they can commit murder, particularly people who are in drug cartels, and that they will not be punished, okay? There have been some justices who've been removed from corruption, and your book, O'Neill, talks about the fact that there is a pervasive sense, particularly at the local level, that many judges are receiving bribes and are in the pockets of drug cartels. In Nigeria, the Freedom House argues that courts face political interference. Well, that means that they're not very independent, that they have a problem of lots of judges being corrupt. They have an issue of lack of funding, equipment, and training on important problems. So that means that even if they do have a justice that is not corrupt and isn't facing pressure from a governor or a president to rule a certain way, they might not even have what they need to make their court function. Okay. In 2018, the National Judicial Council dismissed 2 prominent judges accused of corruption, and the council also said they were investigating another 23. So you could argue that shows that they have a rule of law problem, or you could argue that they are trying to fix their rule of law problem. It sort of depends on which way you take that. An interesting example of sort of like this idea of judicial review is that the Supreme Court ruled in 2010 that when Vice President Goodluck Jonathan, he wanted to have executive powers. He wanted to operate as the president because the actual president was out of the country getting treatment for his serious heart condition. And they were the ones who had the authority to say, yes, Goodluck Jonathan, according to the Constitution, does get to be the president. And so that's an example of them using that power of judicial review. When we look at the United Kingdom, we already talked about how it worked. An example that I really found fascinating this spring is that so Boris Johnson, he said that he wanted to implement Brexit, and his party got the majority in Parliament, but like he and Parliament could not get along about Brexit. So the way he dealt with it is he just said, you know what, this session is done. You guys are going home. And so therefore, by the time you come back, you won't be in session anymore. And so you won't be able to do anything about Brexit. So therefore, I get to make all the decisions about Brexit. Well, multiple parties sued. The question went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared that Prime Minister Boris Johnson's suspension of Parliament just weeks before the deadline was unlawful. They can't say it's unconstitutional because remember, the British don't have a constitution, so they said it's unlawful. And this is an example of how they made the Prime Minister accountable to Parliament and basically kept him in his lane and said, no, you are not allowed to have more powers over the Parliament. Because in their system, Parliament is supposed to have more powers than the Prime Minister. Okay, so you wouldn't have to do that automatically, but because this is a review video, I think it's important to take this as an opportunity to review how the judicial branch works in each country. But you would want to do that brainstorm of examples from the 3 countries that you want to think about. Okay. So when you get this question, so it's asking for whether or not independent judiciaries strengthen or weaken democracies, step 1 is that you're going to brainstorm your pros and cons. After you look at your pros and cons, you want to pick a side for your thesis, and you want to make sure that you have core concepts. And in this case, the core concepts are dealing with term limits, accountability, and rule of law. So you want to make sure that you've got some examples in your brainstorm that tie in to those core concepts. You want to craft a thesis. Remember, half your points are really coming from this thesis because you can't get the reasoning point if you don't get the thesis point. And your thesis can't just say, independent judiciaries strengthen democracies, period. Or independent judiciaries don't strengthen democracy, period. Like you have to have some sort of because reasoning, either in that same sentence or in follow-up sentences for your intro paragraph. Then you want to come up with a brief outline. That could be just circling which examples you're going to use, and then you want to write. So you get 25 minutes for answering this question from the College Board, and I think that your game plan should be to use somewhere in the ballpark of a couple minutes to sort of come up with your plan first before you dive in. That's really going to help you get your best writing possible. Okay? So stop right now and brainstorm your pros and cons to having an independent judiciary. Okay, hopefully you've brainstormed your pros and cons for your independent judiciary. These are some of the ones that I came up with. The pros would be it helps a country maintain their checks and balances, protects their rights and liberties. It helps them establish the rule of law. It helps maintain the separation of powers between the different branches. Cons, judges aren't democratically elected. So you're giving a lot of power to these people who aren't accountable to the people in any way. And the judicial review, which many of these judicial systems have, means that they get to overturn a decision that is made by Congress or Parliament or the president, but somebody who's been democratically elected. So that's a lot of power to give someone who actually hasn't been elected. And in many of these systems, what happens then is that they get the last say, and nobody else gets to say. Okay? So thinking about those examples, then you'd want to think about what examples you have that tie in with the countries for those. So if you think back to the ones that I already brainstormed, I've put there in red little stories that I think would sort of fit in to make that argument. And so I've come up with 3 examples for each side. And then you would get to decide, okay, do I want to argue pro or do I want to argue con? And you should pick whichever one you feel like you have the most substantive examples to give. The College Board will not give you a grade based on whether or not you agree with some sort of predetermined outcome. They don't care. What they do care about is that you are using your knowledge of the course and of political science and of these 6 particular case studies. Okay, so pick whichever side is going to give you the best opportunity as a writer to demonstrate what you know. So an example of a potential outline to answer this question could be, I'm not saying this is what you'd have to do, could be that independent judiciaries weaken democracy. I picked that one because I actually feel like it's harder to argue this way, and I like a challenge. Weaken democracy because if they are filled with corrupt judges, they weaken the rule of law, and because one should not give unlimited power to an unelected branch of government. So I've taken a stance that it weakens democracy, and I've explained that I have reasoning behind it, and I've laid out what my 2 examples are going to be. My example number 1 is going to be that Mexico has a lot of corrupt judges and that this weakens the rule of law. I would then define that because I want that reasoning point, and then I would explain how this makes it more difficult for their democracy to thrive and why having a rule of law is essential to a democracy. Okay. Example number 2, independent judiciaries have binding decisions. Then these are made by unelected judges, which is undemocratic. And I could give the example of when the Nigerian Supreme Court has had to rule on several contested presidential elections, but that hurts the president's legitimacy because they don't have a clear victory. They were given the job because of these unelected judges making that decision as opposed to from the people. And so that is endangering their democracy, and democracy is very weak in a place like Nigeria anyway. So anyway, that is a potential way that you could answer this question. It doesn't have to be the way that you answered this question, but I think what's beneficial about this is to sort of think about how you would tackle this question.